I never thought much about the stories people told around here. Mississippi has always had its share of folklore, things people claim to see in the woods or hear at night when the humidity sits heavy and the kudzu grows so thick you can't see 10 feet into the tree line. I grew up dismissing all of it as superstition, the kind of talk that makes for good campfire conversation but doesn't hold up in daylight. That changed in the summer of 2019, when I took a job maintaining cell towers in the northern part of the state, and I learned that some things people whisper about deserve more respect than I ever gave them. My name is Robert Chen, and I'm 52 years old. I've worked in telecommunications for almost 30 years, mostly climbing towers and performing routine maintenance on equipment that keeps rural areas connected. It's solitary work, often in remote locations where the only company you have is whatever wildlife happens to be passing through. I've encountered bears, wild hogs, venomous snakes, and every kind of weather Mississippi can throw at you. I've worked through storms, 100-degree heat, and nights so dark you can't see your hand in front of your face without a flashlight. None of that prepared me for what I experienced on a service road off Highway 4, about 15 miles west of Holly Springs, in an area where the hill country starts to flatten out into bottomland hardwoods and the forest grows dense enough to swallow sound. The tower I was assigned to service that week was one of the older installations, a 150-foot lattice structure set back from the main highway on a gravel access road that wound through private timberland. The landowner had granted the company an easement years ago, and the road was maintained just well enough to get a service truck through without getting stuck. It was early June, the kind of weather where the heat starts building before 8 in the morning and doesn't let up until well after sunset. The humidity was oppressive, the air so thick with moisture that you sweated through your clothes just standing still. I arrived at the site around 7:30 in the morning, planning to get most of the work done before the worst heat of the day set in. The tower stood in a cleared area maybe 100 feet across, surrounded on all sides by dense forest, mostly oak and hickory, with an understory of privet and honeysuckle that created an almost impenetrable wall of vegetation. The only break in that wall was the access road I'd driven in on, a single lane of gravel that disappeared into the trees behind me. I parked my truck near the base of the tower, gathered my equipment, and started the climb. Tower work is methodical, almost meditative once you get into the rhythm of it. You focus on each step, each handhold, checking equipment as you go, replacing worn components, tightening connections, documenting everything for the maintenance log. The work that morning went smoothly, and by 11 I was back on the ground, sweating heavily but satisfied with the progress. I had maybe another hour of ground-level work to complete, checking the generator and fuel levels, inspecting the equipment shelter, updating the site log. That's when I noticed the silence. I've spent enough time in forests to know that silence is rarely absolute. There's almost always something: birds calling, insects buzzing, the rustle of small animals moving through undergrowth. But standing there next to my truck, wiping sweat from my face with a shop towel, I realized I couldn't hear any of that. The forest around the clearing had gone completely quiet, the kind of stillness that makes you stop what you're doing and pay attention because something is wrong. I looked toward the tree line, scanning the wall of vegetation for movement. Nothing, just dense green foliage and shadows so dark they looked solid. I told myself it was probably nothing, maybe a hawk circling overhead that had spooked the smaller animals into hiding, but the silence continued. 5 minutes, 10 minutes, no birdsong, no insect noise, just the faint whisper of wind moving through the upper canopy and the sound of my own breathing. I went back to work on the generator, trying to ignore the unease that was building in my chest, but I found myself looking up more frequently, checking the tree line, listening for whatever had driven the normal forest sounds away. Around noon, I heard it for the first time, a low sound, almost below the threshold of hearing, like a rumble or a growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It lasted maybe 3 seconds, then stopped. I froze, wrench in hand, listening hard. Nothing followed. I waited, counted to 60, heard nothing else. I convinced myself it was distant thunder, even though the sky was clear and I hadn't seen any storm clouds building. I finished with the generator and moved to the equipment shelter, a small metal building about 10 feet square that housed backup batteries and control systems. The door was secured with a heavy padlock, and I unlocked it, stepping into the stifling heat inside. The shelter had no windows and poor ventilation, and working in there was like being inside an oven. I propped the door open with a concrete block to get some air circulation and started checking the battery connections. I was maybe 10 minutes into that work when I heard something outside. Footsteps. Heavy, deliberate, moving through the gravel near my truck. My first thought was that someone else had driven up, maybe the landowner checking on who was working his property, but I hadn't heard a vehicle approach. I called out, asking if anyone was there. No response. The footsteps stopped. I stepped out of the equipment shelter and looked around the clearing. My truck was exactly where I'd left it, about 30 feet away. The access road was empty in both directions. No one was visible anywhere in the clearing, but I had definitely heard something walking on that gravel, the distinct crunch of weight on loose stone. I walked around my truck, checking all sides, looking for tracks or any sign of what I'd heard. The gravel was too disturbed from my own activity to show clear prints, but near the edge of the clearing, where the gravel transitioned to dirt, I found something that made me stop and stare. A print. Large, canine-shaped, but wrong in ways that made my skin prickle. The print was deeper than any dog track I'd seen, suggesting significant weight, and the toes were spread wider than they should be, with claw marks extending well beyond the pad impression. The size was what really bothered me. The print measured easily 6 inches across, larger than any wolf or coyote, larger than most domestic dogs. I crouched down to examine it more closely, and that's when I noticed there were others, a trail of them leading from the tree line toward my truck, then circling around to the opposite side of the clearing. The stride length between prints was long, too long for the size of the paw, suggesting whatever made them had been moving with purpose. I stood up slowly, feeling exposed in the open clearing, and that's when the smell hit me. It came from the direction of the tree line, carried on a shift in the breeze, a sharp, musky odor that reminded me of wet dog, but stronger, more pungent, with an undertone of something rotten. The smell was thick enough to make me gag, and I backed away from the tree line toward my truck, my eyes scanning the wall of vegetation for any sign of movement. Nothing. Just that impenetrable wall of green and those shadows that seemed too dark, too deep. I made a decision then that probably saved me a lot of trouble. I packed up my equipment faster than I've ever packed up a job site, throwing tools into the truck bed without organizing them the way I usually would, securing the equipment shelter and generator without doing the final checks I would normally complete. The unease I'd been feeling had escalated into something close to fear, a primal instinct that told me I needed to leave this place now, that staying here any longer was dangerous in ways I couldn't articulate. I climbed into my truck, started the engine, and felt a wave of relief when it turned over without hesitation. I put it in gear and started down the access road, glancing repeatedly in my mirrors at the clearing behind me. The tower stood silent and still, the equipment shelter door closed, everything looking exactly as it should. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me leave, something that had been there the entire time I'd been working, observing from the shadows, waiting for something I don't want to think about. The access road wound through the forest for about a quarter mile before reaching the highway. The canopy overhead was thick enough to create a tunnel effect, with sunlight filtering through in scattered patches that made the shadows even deeper by contrast. I drove slowly, carefully, my attention divided between the road ahead and the forest on both sides. That's when I saw it in my peripheral vision, movement in the trees to my right, something large keeping pace with my truck. I turned my head to look directly at it, but whatever it was had already moved behind the dense undergrowth. I caught only an impression of size and dark fur and movement that seemed too fluid, too purposeful to be a deer or wild hog. I accelerated slightly, bringing my speed up to maybe 20 miles per hour, which was as fast as I felt safe going on that narrow gravel road. The movement in the trees continued, still matching my pace, sometimes visible as a dark shape moving between tree trunks, sometimes hidden completely by the vegetation. I had both hands gripped tight on the steering wheel, my heart pounding, telling myself this was just a deer running parallel to the road, that fear and isolation were making me imagine things that weren't there. Then, it broke from the tree line about 50 yards ahead of me, crossing the road in 3 massive bounds that carried it from one side to the other faster than seemed possible for something that size. I hit the brakes instinctively, the truck skidding slightly on the loose gravel, and got my first clear look at what had been following me. It was not a deer. It was not a bear. It was not anything I had ever seen in 30 years of working in remote locations across the southeastern United States. The creature moved on 2 legs, upright like a human, but the proportions were completely wrong. It stood at least 7 feet tall, maybe more, with shoulders far too broad and a torso that seemed too long for the height. The head was unmistakably canine, shaped like a wolf or large dog, but scaled up to a size that matched the massive body. Dark fur covered it entirely, a brown so deep it looked almost black in the shadows under the canopy. What struck me most, what made me sit there with my foot still on the brake and my truck idling in the middle of that access road, was the way it moved. There was no hesitation, no uncertainty in its motion. It crossed that road with the confidence of something that belonged there, something that owned that forest and everything in it. When it reached the opposite tree line, it didn't disappear immediately. It stopped, turned its head to look back at me, and for perhaps 2 seconds we made eye contact through my windshield. The eyes were amber-colored, catching the filtered sunlight and reflecting it back with an intensity that made them seem to glow. There was intelligence in those eyes, awareness and calculation that went far beyond animal instinct. It was looking at me the way I might look at something I was trying to decide about, evaluating, considering, making some kind of decision. Then it turned away and stepped into the forest, and the vegetation swallowed it completely. I sat there for what felt like a long time, but was probably less than a minute, my hands shaking on the steering wheel, my breath coming fast and shallow. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to get out of there, to put distance between myself and whatever I had just seen. I took my foot off the brake and pressed the accelerator, driving the rest of that access road faster than I should have, not caring about the rough gravel or the branches scraping against the sides of my truck. I needed to reach the highway, needed to get back to civilization and other people and a world that made sense. When I finally pulled onto Highway 4, the relief was overwhelming. I drove another 5 miles before I felt calm enough to pull over at a gas station, where I sat in the parking lot with the engine running and the air conditioning on full blast, trying to process what had happened. I wanted to believe I had misidentified something, that heat and isolation and fear had distorted my perception. But I knew what I had seen. I knew the size, the shape, the way it moved. I knew that moment of eye contact and the intelligence I had seen looking back at me. Over the next few days, I tried to continue with my work schedule, but I found myself making excuses to avoid jobs in remote locations. I took urban tower sites, places where I could see other buildings and people and traffic. I stopped accepting assignments in heavily forested areas. My supervisor noticed the change and asked if something was wrong. I told him I was dealing with some personal issues and needed to stay closer to town for a while. He accepted that explanation, and I managed to keep working without having to explain what had really happened, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. I started researching online, looking for information about unusual animal sightings in northern Mississippi, trying to find some explanation for what I had encountered. That's when I discovered that the area around Holly Springs in the hill country to the east has a long history of reports describing exactly what I had seen. People called it different things, the Dogman, the Wolfman, variations on those names, but the descriptions were remarkably consistent. Bipedal canine, 7 to 8 feet tall, dark fur, intelligent behavior, sightings concentrated in forested areas with low human population density. I found accounts from hunters, hikers, rural residents, and other people who had no apparent reason to fabricate stories. Many of them described the same sense of being watched, the same silence in the forest, the same smell I had encountered. Some reported finding tracks that matched what I had seen near my truck. A few described encounters where the creature had followed them or approached their vehicles, behavior that suggested curiosity or territorial assertion rather than simple animal fear. What disturbed me most was reading about the intelligence attributed to these creatures. Witness after witness described eyes that showed awareness, behavior that suggested planning and decision-making, vocalizations that seemed designed to communicate or intimidate. These were not descriptions of random animal encounters. These were accounts of interactions with something that understood its environment and the humans moving through it. I spoke with one person who had worked as a hunting guide in the area for over 20 years. He agreed to meet me at a diner in Holly Springs, and we talked for over 2 hours about what he had seen and heard during his time in those forests. He told me that locals who spend significant time in the woods know there are areas to avoid, places where the forest feels wrong and the normal rules don't seem to apply. He said most people don't talk about it openly because they don't want to be dismissed as crazy or superstitious, but the knowledge is there, passed quietly between hunters and landowners and people who work in timber and conservation. He told me about finding tracks he couldn't identify, about hearing vocalizations that didn't match any known animal, about that particular quality of silence that settles over an area when something apex is present. He had never seen one clearly himself, but he knew other people who had, credible people with decades of outdoor experience who described encounters that matched mine almost exactly. When I asked him why he thought Mississippi seemed to have so many of these reports, he offered a perspective that made sense. The state has vast forested areas, particularly in the northern hill country and the bottomlands along the rivers. Much of that forest is privately owned timberland with minimal human traffic, large connected tracts where something could exist without regular human contact. The terrain is varied, providing diverse habitat and abundant prey populations of deer, wild hogs, and smaller game. The climate is mild enough to support year-round activity, and perhaps most importantly, the culture here doesn't encourage people to report strange encounters. People keep quiet, handle their own business, and don't invite the kind of attention that comes from claiming you saw something that science says doesn't exist. I went back to that tower site once more, about 3 weeks after my initial encounter. I had to complete the final checks I had skipped during my hasty departure, and I wasn't going to let fear prevent me from doing my job properly. But I went prepared this time. I brought a coworker with me, told him I needed help with some of the ground equipment, which was technically true, even if it wasn't the real reason I wanted company. We arrived in the late morning, worked efficiently, and were gone by early afternoon. I didn't see anything unusual during that visit, didn't hear anything concerning, didn't find any new tracks. The forest behaved exactly as a forest should, with birds calling and insects buzzing and the normal background noise of a healthy ecosystem. But I noticed my coworker kept looking at the tree line, kept scanning the shadows between the trees. At one point, he asked me if I felt like we were being watched. I told him it was probably just the isolation playing tricks on his mind, that remote sites always feel a little unsettling when you're not used to them. He nodded and went back to work, but I saw him check the tree line several more times before we left. I've continued working in telecommunications, but I've become more selective about the sites I accept. I avoid the most remote locations when possible, and when I do have to work in heavy forest, I make sure to arrive early, finish quickly, and leave before the sun gets too low. I pay attention to the forest sounds, to that quality of silence that signals something is wrong. I trust my instincts more now than I did before that day in June. I don't know what I saw on that access road. I can't prove it was what people call a dogman, can't provide evidence that would satisfy a skeptic or convince someone who wasn't there. What I can tell you is that I saw something that moved with intelligence and purpose, something that looked at me with awareness that went beyond animal cognition, something that exists in the forests of northern Mississippi, whether science acknowledges it or not. The experience changed how I think about wilderness and isolation and the things we assume we understand about the natural world. I used to believe that all the large predators in North America were documented and cataloged, that we knew everything significant about the fauna in our forests. I don't believe that anymore. I think there are things living in the remote areas of this country that we encounter rarely enough that they remain outside official recognition, things that have learned to avoid human contact while still maintaining territories that occasionally overlap with ours. Mississippi, with its combination of suitable habitat, low population density, and cultural tendency toward privacy, provides ideal conditions for something to remain hidden. The forests here are extensive enough to support a population of large predators without regular sightings. The terrain is varied enough to provide everything needed for survival. And the people who do encounter something unusual are more likely to stay quiet than to report it publicly. I still work in those forests. I still climb towers in remote locations. But I do it with a different awareness now, with the understanding that I'm not always alone, even when no other humans are visible. Something else uses those forests, something that watches from the shadows and evaluates the people who pass through its territory. Most of the time, it chooses to remain hidden. Occasionally, for reasons I don't understand, it chooses to reveal itself. I don't expect everyone to believe this account. I understand the skepticism that comes with claims of creatures that official science doesn't recognize. But I'm telling you what happened to me on that service road west of Holly Springs, what I saw with my own eyes in broad daylight under clear sky. I'm telling you that Mississippi's reputation as a hotspot for these encounters is based on something real, something that multiple credible witnesses have experienced independently over many years. If you spend time in the remote forests of this state, particularly in the northern hill country where the woods grow dense and the human presence thins out, pay attention to what the forest is telling you. Listen for that quality of silence that signals a predator's presence. Trust the instinct that tells you something is wrong. And if you see something that doesn't match any animal you know, something that looks at you with intelligence and awareness, don't dismiss it as imagination or misidentification. Accept that you've encountered something genuine, something that shares these forests with us, but remains just outside our full understanding. I carry that encounter with me every day. It sits in the back of my mind when I drive remote access roads, when I work in isolated locations, when I hear sounds in the forest that I can't quite identify. I don't live in fear, but I live with respect for what I know is out there. And I hope that anyone who reads this will approach the wilderness with that same respect, with the understanding that our maps and our science don't capture everything that exists in the wild places of this country. Mississippi's forests hold secrets that most people never encounter. I encountered one of those secrets, and it changed everything I thought I knew about what lives in the shadows between the trees.